Hey everyone, my name is Jose and this is my review of the OnePlus 10T. So let's get started. Unboxing the OnePlus 10T is fairly similar to unboxing other OnePlus phones. It has its signature OnePlus red theming throughout the experience. It comes with the SIM to ejector, stickers, USB-A to USB adapter, the phone itself, a 150 watt charger, a USB-C to USB-C cable, and that's pretty much it. You might notice that the box is a lot shorter lengthwise compared to previous phones like the OnePlus 8T. This smaller design is probably to be more eco-friendly, but at least you get a charger inside the box. Now onto the basic overview of the phone. It has a 6.7-inch 1080p 120Hz OLED display. It has 4800 mAh battery. It has the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1. It comes in 128 or 256 gigabytes of UFS 3.1 storage with 8 or 16 gigabytes of RAM. It has an optical in-display fingerprint reader. It has an IP rating of 54, but only in the United States. And it has a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main sensor. I have the Moonstone Black variant. It's a 2022 release date phone. It came out in August and it retails for $750 with a current 10% discount for $650. Now I will start with the OS, which is OxygenOS 12, which is still fine given that it's been declining since the past 2 years. I know how controversial OxygenOS has been lately, but it's still relatively clean and simple like before. This phone is getting 3 years of Android version updates and 4 years of security updates, so that's good. I will, however, point out the things I don't like about this skin. To start, this phone has some bloatware. Mainly it's just Netflix, TikTok, and the OnePlus community app, which is not a big deal at all, but it's still relevant to the welcoming experience. I don't like that swipe down on the left is notifications and controls while the right side is the widgets panel. I would prefer it if they would switch places, but you can't change it in the settings. And in the gallery app, it won't tell me the resolution of a video, which I find to be very annoying. I could ramble a lot about OxygenOS, which is why I would suggest looking into what others think about OxygenOS 12 and 13 because that needs to be its own dedicated video. I would also suggest you look at my recent video about why I think that OnePlus phones should just switch to ColorOS, no hesitation, because it relates a lot about the current state of OnePlus phones. Onto the display, it has a 6.7-inch 1080p 120Hz 10-bit OLED display, which I think looks nice, but nothing special. It's a flat display, which is probably a good choice for this phone. My only complaint is that it isn't bright enough around 800 nits. I wish it was brighter, and it doesn't have LPTO to dynamically scale the refresh rate. And it has Gorilla Glass 5 instead of 6, so that kind of sucks. Outside, the phone is visible and no complaints there. I have the Moonstone Black variant of the phone with the other being Jade Green. I like how this color turned out with its textured finish that doesn't leave any fingerprints behind. It's also a matte back that looks really nice, but it could feel more premium. The only other part of the design that I feel is lacking is the frame around the phone, which is made out of plastic and not metal. There's two things I want to point out with the form factor of the phone, which relates to the camera module. The first is that the wide and ultrawide sensors have a silver camera ring, while the macro camera doesn't. It's almost like OnePlus doesn't acknowledge that the macro camera is a camera by not giving it a ring or at least a flat silver ring around it. The rings are there to give the cameras additional space in the body, which the macro camera doesn't need, but it looks off to me, so I had to point it out. The second thing is that the camera bump is actually kind of small with the curvature around. In photos, the bump looks way bigger than it is in person, so I'm glad it's not that big. Now with the speakers, it's stereo speakers, but it doesn't sound like it. The earpiece speaker is very quiet and you hear all the sound from the bottom speaker. It has big channel imbalance, but the speakers themselves sound fine around 60% volume. It sounds super harsh on max volume, especially with high frequencies. Also, there's no headphone jack, which is kind of expected. Haptics on the phone feel punchy and responsive. I don't know how to describe haptics, but I can tell you that haptics on the phone do not feel weak like how I've seen them on other phones. It feels really premium and I do appreciate it. And quick mention that this phone does not have an alert slider like how we've seen them on OnePlus phones. They said they couldn't fit an alert slider in, which is obviously a lie because it was to reduce production costs. Battery usage and charging is where this phone excels. It has a 4800 mAh battery that is plenty to get you through the day with its 120Hz screen and other things that drain battery. It also has a 150 watt charger that can charge from 0 to 100 in under 20 minutes. North American electrical systems are likely to max out at 125 watts instead of 150 watts, but it still charges very fast. There's no wireless charging on the phone, but I wouldn't consider that a huge downside. Performance on this phone is really good considering that's probably its main selling point. It has a Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1, which is the overclocked version of the chip. It's currently the best processor made by Qualcomm, so you can expect top performance on this phone. COD Mobile on max settings gave me no problems as expected with a steady 60 FPS. The ultra frame rate is limited to 90 FPS despite the 120Hz screen, yet I still retained a steady frame rate nearing 90 FPS. Honkai Impact III was a similar experience. On max settings, including these additional settings, I saw a reliable 60 FPS. However, there is no option for 90 FPS, which I hope the game developers will make this phone compatible for 90 FPS. I did see some stutters to 45 FPS in some cutscenes and transitions, but the combat gameplay is very smooth with little stutters. I also tested Genshin Impact at the highest settings to benchmark the performance and thermals. In the open world, the FPS will vary between 38 to 52 FPS with mostly an average of 44 FPS, but the game doesn't really stutter all that much despite the frame rate dips. Genshin is a very demanding game, so I'm glad that the phone doesn't really stutter with the game. Thermals on all of the games are quite manageable, but I noticed that Genshin does make the back of the phone kind of hot at around 40 Celsius, but you won't really notice that heat when you're holding the phone horizontally. Also relating to performance, the 10T has a gaming widget where you can access things like Discord and other apps. My favorite feature is this performance monitor, which tells you your current FPS along with CPU and GPU usage. There's also a performance and battery saving mode, but the performance mode did not make any significant improvements to Genshin. Something I wish this phone had is capacitive touch shoulder triggers like how other gaming phones have them. I'll explain that reasoning later, but just know that I wish it had it. Finally, we have the cameras with a 50 megapixel wide, 8 megapixel ultra wide, 2 megapixel macro, and 16 megapixel selfie. Starting with the 50 megapixel wide, it's a 1/1.56 inch type sensor. It's the IMX766, which has been down to 12.5 megapixels, and it's pretty good. Daytime shots are nice with a balanced HDR look to them. Saturation is solid, but colors look slightly inconsistent with those HDR shots. Zoomed in photos are digital crops and they are fine up to 3x. Portraits are nice even with non-human subjects, and I didn't have a problem with the cutouts. Nighttime shots are nice considering how fast they are taken, usually 1.5 seconds, and are automatic. I wish I could make the night shots longer, but I can't. They also have great noise reduction. Video is also good, but dynamic range and exposure could be a lot better, especially with shadows. The main sensor has OIS for video stabilization, and it's decent. Ultra steady mode is capped at 1080p and forced at 60 FPS. It's good if you need a steady mode. Portrait video looks decent even with a complex subject. Night video is nice with little noise and good exposure, but shadows are dark. Then we have an 8 megapixel ultrawide. That's a 1/4 inch type sensor, which I think is way too small for a $750 phone. During the day, the shots are lacking some detail and are a bit noisy, but dynamic range seems to be competent, even with good exposure control. Night shots have automatic night mode and they still lack some detail, but at least they have good noise reduction. They still lack saturation and dynamic range. I almost forgot to record ultrawide video because I recorded in 4K, but the ultrawide can't record in 4K, so it won't show up until I switch to 1080p. Ultrawide video is similar to the photos, it's just very lacking and inconsistent with its quality. Since we have a cheap ultrawide sensor with no autofocus for macros, they put a 2 megapixel macro sensor, which is just a slap in the face for a phone like this. Photos are fine, just give the sensor enough light. Lastly, we have a 16 megapixel selfie shooter. It looks good. The portrait failed with the frame of my glasses, but it did a good job with thin hair. HDR and exposure seems pleasing. Selfie video looks very processed with lacking dynamic range and low saturation. I recommend the ultra steady mode for selfie video, but it still lacks dynamic range and has some noise. Portrait selfie looks good with good cutouts, but nothing special. From those 3 selfie videos, they seem inconsistent with dynamic range and saturation and noise, so maybe that's something to consider. I won't forget to mention that there's no Hasselblad licensing on this phone, which I will explain later on, but that's also a bummer here. And as a quick demo, here's the phone taking photos with and without AI scene detection, which I will say this time, I do not like AI scene detection on this phone because it does not detect scenes consistently, and it applies some saturation photo wide even when no scene is detected. If you watch my video about AI scene detection, you would know that these adjustments made by the 10T is very similar to what the Red Magic 6R did. All it does is just boost up saturation when it detects a scene, and it does not make any meaningful adjustments to contrast, shadows, or anything else in the scene. So the 10T does not get my approval for AI scene detection. The last thing I want to talk about is my investigative tech journalism about this phone, which is just a rant more than anything else. When I did my OnePlus 8T review, I was confused on why the 8T was cheaper than the 8 Pro when it had better things than the 8 Pro while also having some lower specs than it. Now, in a 2022 OnePlus phone, the 10T also suffers from that identity crisis. The 10T is better than the 10 Pro because it's $100 cheaper. It has 150 watts charging compared to the 65 watts in the North American variant and 80 watts in the international variant of the 10 Pro. It has a faster processor and it has more RAM at 16 gigabytes. The 10T, however, has a slightly smaller battery at 4,800 milliamp hours versus 5,000. It has less scratch resistance on the display. It has less peak brightness on the display and no LPTO. It has a less premium build quality. It has worse camera hardware, no Hasselblad licensing, and no alert slider. If you take it at face value, there is no good reason to buy the 10 Pro. If they keep this up, you should always wait for the T to come out rather than the Pro. Now, for the conclusion. This phone has a broken identity. The 10T clearly did not learn from the 8T because of how weird it was to be better than the Pro model while also making compromises. This 10T still has compromises. It compromises mostly on the cameras with its really mediocre set of cameras. They are not bad by nature, but for being a $650 phone coming from OnePlus, it's a bad look for them. If you bought a $650 Poco phone with these cameras, that might make sense, but not for a OnePlus phone. And it doesn't have Hasselblad licensing because A, it probably costs money per device to put Hasselblad licensing on the phone, and B, how is Hasselblad supposed to associate themselves with mediocre camera hardware? Not having Hasselblad licensing is actually a good thing because it would have been a bad look for them if they did put it on the phone. And this phone compromises on the display by not having LPTO and by not being super bright, but at the same time, I would argue that that's a fair compromise to make. You will continue to have a broken identity for the T phones if you can't figure out why you're making them in the first place. It has a faster processor than the Pro, but it has worse cameras. So it's Pro on the performance, but not Pro on the cameras? It makes no sense that a Pro phone is not faster than this cheaper T phone. So who is this phone for? I would say gamers and performance goers. You get an overclocked chip for $650, very fast charging, a big battery, 120 Hz, it's all there. But this phone had a compromise on the cameras and the build quality and the alert slider and other things just to meet that price. And that's why I wish this phone had shoulder triggers so that its identity could be a little bit more clear while also giving a feature to the gamers out there who is probably your main audience anyways. It's almost like a glorified Poco phone. It's all about performance and battery, and these phones will make compromises in the camera and the build quality and other aspects just to keep the price down, except that the OnePlus 10T is just more premium than the Poco phone. To that, I say despite all of what I said, you should consider this phone for the price to performance ratio. If you don't need good cameras and all you care about is the performance of the phone with the SoC of the phone, the overclocked 8 Plus Gen 1, the 120 Hz 10-bit OLED display, the 150 watts of fast charging, the very big battery it has. This is a very good phone for it not being a gaming phone. It's just being more casual out there. But whether you get this phone or you get something else, the 10T's broken identity is something to not forget about. If you enjoyed this review, then please give me a like. And if you didn't like what you see, well, you know what? I also hope that you too don't have a broken identity like this phone. But if you did like what you see, please like, comment, and subscribe. And the T phones will continue to confuse me on why they even exist in the first place when you make really weird shortcuts that people are gonna call you out for. So why do you even exist in the first place? Last thing, I would encourage you to check out my recent video about why I think OnePlus should stop using OxygenOS and just use ColorOS. I know it's a really hot take on the current OnePlus situation, but I think my argument is profoundly made in that video. So if you're interested, I highly encourage you to check it out. Anyways, thank you for watching. It's been a long time since I did a review, but actually doing it again reminded me of how fun it is, and I'm really happy I got to do it again. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.